All right. Our next speaker for TRiRODS is Samantha Mau, uh, and her talk is entitled Java Client Library for the HTTP API. Take it away.
Hi everyone, I'm Samantha Mau, and this summer I worked with the iRODS team to develop a Java client library for the iRODS HTTP API. So a little bit about me, I'm from Georgia. I've spent my entire life there. I study computer engineering at Georgia Tech, and I'll be a third year there this fall. And some personal interests of mine include rollerblading and biking. I also love the beach, and dolphins are my favorite animal, so I know a bunch of random facts about them. But moving on to what I actually did this summer, iRODS has been transitioning from a REST API to a new HTTP API. And the goal of my project was to develop a new client library in Java to wrap developers' HTTP calls. As with any project, the first step in creating this Java client was planning. I began by examining existing Java wrappers for other APIs and experimenting with them to kind of understand their structure and identify common characteristics. And so this image here is some of the notes I made while looking at those different wrappers. And during the initial weeks, I also spent considerable time discussing design ideas with the other interns, Chris Lee and Chris Farber, who were also developing wrappers in different languages. And this was largely to ensure that there was a cohesive flow between the wrappers, and it's also just nice to have different perspectives. So this image here is a collaborative doc I made with those other interns to document how some of those method signatures may look like. And this image here is a Figma design we made together to map out the workflow. The middle green box has all the endpoints, and then the blue boxes surrounding it are the associated requests for each endpoint. So the client library that I worked on this summer allows developers to connect to the HTTP API using Java. Users simply need to instantiate an instance of the iRODS HTTP client and pass in that base URL. And this abstracts the complexity of direct API interactions and allows developers to make those API calls easily and efficiently. So for example, let's say a developer wanted to remove a user. Instead of having to execute this long curl command, they would instead be able to use this simple one-liner that accomplishes the same task. And each method returns a response object that contains the HTTP status code and the response body that is provided by the API. So this method to remove a user would have this as the response object. Here is the HTTP status code of 200, which is, the status code of 200. And here's the body of the response, which is a JSON containing the iRODS response that displays a status code of 0. Which means the request was a success. And each request has its own response. It just depends what is listed in the API documentation. And to access the HTTP status code and use the response body, the user can simply use get HTTP status code and get body. So for example, if we wanted to authenticate a RODS user and store its token to use it in other methods later on, we can do so by executing this method. The first parameter is the username, and then the second parameter is the password. And as per the API document, since the response to an authentication call is the token itself, then we can simply set the variable RODS token to the response body of the response object. And from my discussions with the other interns and from what I observed in the existing wrappers, we decided that using a method chaining approach should be best. So here, the first method called corresponds to one of the 10 endpoints, such as user and group operations, and all 10 endpoints are listed here. And the second method in the chain makes the specific request, such as removing the user. And each endpoint has its own set of requests, with some only containing 2, and others containing up to 18, making for a total of 64 requests from all the endpoints combined. And these requests right here, for example, are part of the users and groups endpoint. And so with the other interns, we kind of decided that this would be the best way to handle the endpoints, especially since some endpoints contain requests with the same name. And so this kind of just allows us to distinguish and organize the different operations. And then, of course, we have the arguments, which are the ones listed in the API. And all authenticated calls require a token to be passed in. So for example, the remove user method has the token, the name of the user to be removed, and then the name of the zone for the user as parameters. Another part of this project was testing to make sure everything was functioning. I wrote a lot of tests by referencing the Python tests that were being used in the HTTP API repo, like this one right here, which tests support for jQuery 1 and the query endpoint. And then this is the test I wrote for my application based on that Python one. This is this is one of the relatively shorter tests. Some of the longer ones wouldn't have been able to fit on the slide, but I wrote tests for every endpoint to ensure that it should work as it should, which ended up being a total of 38 tests. And testing revealed that a lot of my test failures were due to simple typos, which a lot of times happened because I would copy and paste code from the previous method without changing the operation names accordingly. For example, this is the add method for the zones endpoint, but I had accidentally left the operation as remove instead of add, which is why the request wasn't working. But again, this was one of the easier bugs to fix. I think the method that took me the longest to implement was the write request in the data objects endpoint, mainly because it was using multi-part form data and I wasn't really too familiar with that. And so throughout the summer, I had a lot of challenges and successes, but I definitely learned a lot. One of the first things I had to do was familiarize myself with iRODS and how to use the different I commands. I also learned about a lot about Docker and how Docker containers and images work since my iRODS deployment was through Docker. So this understanding was essential for setting up and managing my environment efficiently. I also discovered the importance of reading logs, which was really useful when trying to figure out why a command would work through curl but not through my Java application. I also learned a lot about Git and GitHub. I had never really squashed and rebased before this, so Git School with Alan and Terrell was very helpful. I had also never really used Git on a team project prior to this, so I learned a lot about the process of making PRs and resolving comments, and Corey really did help me a lot with that. And then I learned how helpful it is to just make issues as you find them, and then worrying about them later rather than trying to fix everything all at once, which gets confusing. And then you end up forgetting what you were originally working on anyway. Um, and it was interesting to experience being on the other side of API calls. This perspective gave me a deeper understanding of how APIs are used, since I've only really ever interacted with APIs by being the one to make the calls. It was fun designing and implementing the API endpoints and handling the requests. I learned a lot about design as well. It was really important to ensure my wrapper remained intuitive and consistent with the norm, and also to maintain cohesion with the other HTTP API wrappers and the other languages. And there was also a lot of iteration. For example, I had a lot of back and forth on how I wanted to implement the optional parameters. And these are actually some of the iterations I had for the remove method, which has recurse and no trash as optional fields. At first, I kind of had like a builder notation where you would just chain methods to to set the optional arguments if needed. Then I changed it so that the user has to put in a value for every field using -1 for integers or null for strings if they didn't want to use it. Um, and talking to Corey and experimenting with the wrapper kind of helped me refine my approach and come to my finalized version, where any optional fields are encapsulated within a class. And if users want to utilize the optional params, then they just need to instantiate the class and set the desired values. And if the developer doesn't want any of the optional parameters to begin with, then they can simply set that field to null. And then moving on, I also learned the importance of not overcomplicating things. For one of my initial endpoints I worked on, I tried to create separate classes to map the JSON responses. However, as I kind of progressed, I realized that this approach added unnecessary complexity and limited the user's ability to customize their interactions, especially since not everybody was using, or not everyone will be using the same libraries I'm using. So I kind of decided to scrap that idea. And working with the other interns highlighted the importance of having like diverse perspectives. And it was nice being able to bounce ideas off of each other. And they're both so talented, so it was nice being able to work with them and to hear their ideas. I just also improved my coding practices just in regards to writing clean, maintainable code and following established conventions. I got better in the way I took notes. In the beginning, I just had a page where I kind of just copied and pasted everything relevant, and then it ended up being really confusing and jumbled. So I got myself more organized and developed a more structured approach by documenting what I did throughout the day in a coherent manner so that it would be useful if I needed to go look back on it in a couple of weeks. And then I also just had a page of just common commands I was using that made it easy to find and reference without needing to do like a whole scavenger hunt. And finally, one of my most important takeaways from this internship was the value of seeking assistance. Um, the team was incredibly helpful and responsive. At the beginning of the summer, I did find myself hesitating to ask questions because I guess I didn't want to seem incompetent or like I didn't know what I was doing, but I really did not know what I was doing. So, and I found like reaching out saved me a lot of time and helped me gain like a better understanding of the work. So if I ever ran into issues and I couldn't figure it out after a while, I could just ping the Google chat and have someone help me. So it was incredibly valuable to have such talented and experienced people on the team, and I truly appreciate that support and assistance. Um, and actually, while I was making the slide, I realized it was a lot longer than I was originally anticipating. And I feel like I am talking about this for a really long time, but all this stuff was really important to me, and I really did learn a lot throughout the summer, and I'm really grateful that I got to experience it. And wow, that was a lot of reallys, but I truly did learn a lot. And I really enjoyed being able to work with the whole iRODS team, and I'd like to extend a thank you to Corey and Terrell for their support and for always being free to hop on a call to help me with anything. I know for a while there, I was on the call with Corey about every other day. Um, I really appreciate it. And also thank you to the other interns I worked with, Chris Barber and Chris Lee. It was nice being able to collaborate with you all. And I had an overall amazing experience with the iRODS team, so thank you for letting me be a part of it. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And thank you again for your time.
All right, thank you. Do we have any questions for Samantha? So we have one question. We have a question from Brittany.
Yeah, I was just curious. You had mentioned in the beginning you were hesitant to reach out for help because, you didn't want the perception of that you didn't know what you were doing. And I was wondering if there was anything as your internship progressed that made you feel more comfortable going to the team and asking questions. Like if there was something that happened and it kind of switched on for you to ask, or if just over time you built a relationship. I'm curious about that.
I think the main thing was that over time I did realize that everybody was helpful and that they were open to answering questions and that nobody was gonna like shut me away or like I guess like belittle me for not knowing. So yeah, like over time I realized that nobody was out like to hate me, I guess. And so it made it easier. And everybody was really friendly. So
Cool, thanks.
thank you.
I have a
Do we have,
question.
yeah,
I have one more. Yeah. Hi, Samantha. Good job. That's amazing. What was the most surprising thing this summer related to this work?
I guess the most surprising thing was I guess I didn't realize how much iteration is involved in the process of like developing things. And I know I spent a lot of time talking about planning, um, but you can really have a concrete detailed plan and then spend some time experimenting with it and testing it, only to realize that that original plan was not as good as you first thought. And then having to go in and revise it. So I guess it was surprising to see that you could um, that your original plan is never going to go as anticipated. And I realized how important it is to have other people's feedback because you can become so immersed in your own project that, of course, most things are going to make sense to you. But it's nice to have an outsider give some opinions. Like, for example, I really liked the builder notation I was using initially. But when I showed it to Corey, he kind of mentioned how having a developer call a method that within that method calls another private method was kind of not the most ideal. So that led me on to that whole iteration process. But yeah,
That's great. Thank you.
thank you.
do we have any more questions for Samantha? All right. Thank you, Samantha.